The research we did of the top 200 CEOs who've been highest performing, turns out they created an incremental $5 trillion of value versus the average CEOs in their peer set, in their industries. That's equivalent almost to the GDP of Germany.
Hello and welcome to FranklinCovey on Leadership. I'm your host, Will Hodling, FranklinCovey's head of product. In these conversations, we'll speak with many of the world's most respected leaders to understand the mistakes, methods, and mindsets that enabled them to have the impact they have today. We hope that their hard-earned insights accelerate you on your journey. Today's guest is Carolyn Dewar. Carolyn is the founder and global co-leader of McKinsey's CEO practice, where she advises CEOs, founders, and boards leading through growth, transformation, and crises. She is the author of the New York Times best-selling CEO Excellence and the author of the upcoming CEO for All Seasons, which is being released today. In today's wide-ranging conversation, we talk about the mindsets that distinguish the highest-performing CEOs, the CEO experience and transition over the course of the job. We touch on CEO performance and pay, and talk about what's next for CEOs across America and the world. Carolyn Dewar, welcome to FranklinCovey on Leadership.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to see you, Will.
Absolutely. Very excited for today's conversation. So you have spent a lot of your career dedicated to researching and writing about CEO excellence and performance. Why? What motivates you to stay so engaged and excited about this topic?
I just think CEOs doing well is so important, both for those individuals, but more importantly, the organizations they lead and all of the stakeholders that are affected. I've spent about 25 years going deep on strategy and transformation and all of the classic, business value creation, and kept coming back to this realization that at the center of all of it is one human with an almost impossible job. And how do we set that person up for success?
In 2022, you wrote, along with a few other folks at McKinsey, you wrote CEO Excellence, the 6 mindsets that distinguish the best leaders from the rest. It became an NYT bestseller. Congratulations. It's a wonderful book. I've read it and dog-eared many pages. How did you validate that these are the 6 mindsets? We get this question all the time. 7 habits of highly effective people. Why not 8? Why not 6? So talk to me about the research process that led to those 6.
Absolutely. The research process for CEO Excellence, which has continued through what we're doing today, the first piece we had to look at is who truly are the high-performing CEOs. We didn't want to take advice or guidance from just the average. There's plenty of research out there saying, here's typically what people do. But we said, no, we want to look at the folks who've done exceptionally well, and how are they different from the typical? And so the research process, we looked at everyone who's been a CEO of a Fortune 1000 company in the last 25 years. It turns out there's a couple of thousand of them because they've cycled through the same company a couple of times. We then applied several filters. One, you had to be in the top quintile of performance relative to your peers in your industry. So that normalizes for the fact that tech might be growing faster than mining, but in your industry, you were in the top 20%. You had to have been in the CEO role for at least 6 years. There wasn't a magic to that number 6, but we wanted it to be long enough that decisions you made early in your tenure, you're now having to live with those decisions and the second and third order consequences, right? You were eating your own cooking, so to speak. And then we applied filters around reputation and resilience and innovation, and we made sure we had a broad spectrum of folks across industries and geographies. And so with that set, it brought that 2,000 down to about 200 CEOs by applying those filters. Those were the people we spoke to. Those were the people we dove in deep. And as we spoke with each of them, that was the question we were asking. What sets you apart? How do you do and think differently than others? And I think the reason we came to mindsets is everyone has their own style, their own operating model, right? Jamie Dimon acts very differently than Mary Barra, maybe on any given day. But what was remarkably consistent was the way they thought about the role. And those were the 6 mindsets that kept coming out that just were consistent across these high performers, yet different maybe than the average.
Unsurprising that you would have a very rigorous methodology coming from a senior practice leader, a senior partner and practice leader at McKinsey. I was not anticipating you were going to say, we just chose them randomly. So I love hearing about that methodology leading into it. So I'm sure you get this question from CEOs all the time. 6 mindsets, which is the most important? How do you answer that? Is there a single mindset that is the kind of chief mindset among them all, the CEOs of the mindsets? Tell me about that.
That's an interesting question. I think there were two questions we were trying to answer in CEO Excellence. The first was, what is the CEO job anyway? As you can imagine, you ask a lot of people, you get different answers. And that brought us down to the 6 responsibilities. Before we even get into mindsets, there's 6 parts of the job, or 6 spinning plates, that all these leaders have to keep spinning all the time. And we often get the question, which part of the job is more important? The reality is you need to keep all 6. None can hit the floor and break. Now, the one you're focused on in any given time might be because it's a little wobbly, right? Maybe it's high risk. Maybe you don't have the right leader in place. Maybe it's a new situation. So you might be shifting your focus, but the trick as a CEO is you need to keep all the pieces happening all the time. It's around aligning direction, setting the organization and aligning them, getting your team working really well, managing the board, managing external stakeholders, and then yourself. All of those pieces need to be true. Where you're spending your time may vary in the mindset you bring to it.
I want to ask you about a few of the mindsets, and I would love to hear examples of CEOs that you think exemplify this mindset really effectively. The first is make bold moves early. Maybe explain that mindset to our listeners, and if you could tell a story about a CEO that you think has done an amazing job representing that mindset.
Absolutely. So the first foundational role of a CEO is to set the direction for the company, right? Where are we headed? How will we get there? Are we allocating our resources in a way that makes sense? Putting our money where our mouth is on that. And the overall mindset for how you truly set great direction is to be bold. Now, to be fair, it probably should have been be bold and be right, because if you were bold and wrong, you never would have made it into our data set of high performers. But if you were incremental, you also wouldn't have made it. So all of these exceptional CEOs had taken real risks and being quite bold in what they do. I think about Ajay Banga and how he set the tone at MasterCard, right? He was there for over a decade. He's now on to the World Bank and other amazing things. And he took their market cap from 13 billion to over 300 billion, right? An incredible, success story as you think about the growth. And one of the things he did to be bold was to reframe for people what winning looks like. When he took over at MasterCard, most of the hallway chatter was, how do we beat Visa? How do we beat American Express? How do we increase our market share of this piece called credit cards? And he, with his leadership team, stepped back and looked at the data and looked around and said, well, if we can all remember back almost 15 years ago, it turns out that less than 10% of the world's transactions were credit cards. All the other 90% were still cash and other various ways of bartering even in certain countries. And he said, why are we fighting over this one little piece? We need to reframe the game, or in private equity language, right, expand our TAM. What is it that we're trying to go after? And the frame they came out was, well, our goal is to kill cash. Now, he's actually quite a mild-mannered guy, so the kill cash is quite an aggressive term. But it gave permission to his organization to say, let's not just worry about increasing our little piece of the pie. We need to expand the whole pie. What would it look like if we became the trusted transactor in the world for all kinds of transactions, big and small? And what did that unleash in its organization? It gave them permission to challenge. We don't do that around here, right? Permission to get into debit and online and all of these other things that seem normal now, but back then was quite a radical idea. And it was him as a CEO that kind of gave permission to the organization to think that way.
How much strategic thinking went into that decision? Make bold moves early is a call to action to act. And I think a lot of times CEOs can get stuck in analysis paralysis. There's the famous George Patton quote, a good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week. How important is it to just go versus take a bunch of time to really come up with the right idea? And maybe use that same example and talk about the strategic thinking that led into let's kill cash.
Sure. I mean, I think that is part of the challenge of being a CEO. You need to be willing to make decisions and act with incomplete information. Right? It doesn't mean being reckless and running off and doing things that you haven't looked into, but sometimes you actually just need to make bold calls and help the organization point in a certain direction. So with that, for Ajay, I think they set that strategy in a thoughtful way. They had understood what the market dynamics were and where they could go. They didn't then micromanage every single decision within the organization to make that happen. They made some bold moves, they made acquisitions, they shifted their business model. Those were things done from the top. But they also unleashed people underneath to go and do all the micro things that it would take to make it happen. There's something that struck me as you were talking just then, Will, to be honest, was a set of conversations from 2 weeks ago where I was with 150 business leaders in New York, and the prevailing mindset, they were all CFOs and CEOs, was, gosh, there's so much uncertainty in the world. And everyone felt almost paralyzed. Like there's so much uncertainty between geopolitics, tariffs, climate change, population shifts. How can we possibly plan? How can we possibly set strategy? And the provocation that came out of that session for all these leaders was, you actually have to. So even in this world of uncertainty, it's the job of leaders not just to stand still like deer in headlights. There are certain things that are knowable, right? We might not be comfortable with the pace of change right now, but AI is happening. A shift in geopolitics is happening. These things are happening. And even if they're new and scary, it's actually up to you as a leader to start saying, okay, what are we going to do about it? And most of the 2 days of that session became about these leaders making courageous choices of what are we going to do? Because we have to do something. And I think that's so important.
Yeah, I think it's a powerful anecdote and reminder that uncertainty can be paralyzing, but ultimately it is the responsibility of a leader to act courageously and decide amidst that uncertainty. Another one of the mindsets that really stood out to me was do what only the CEO can do. Can you explain that mindset? And again, share an example of a CEO that you think exemplifies it.
I love this one. And frankly, it's one that all of us can use in whatever role we are in. The CEO role is unrelenting in the demands, right? You could fill your days with all kinds of requests. And so how do you as a CEO think about what you spend your time on, where you focus, and how you show up every day? Because you're the scarcest resource in an organization, right? There's only one of you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And if I'm using Ajay Banga again, we'll come back to another one, I promise. He was about 6 months into his role, and he woke up in Singapore. He'd flown there. He had hundreds of emails that were unanswered. He felt overwhelmed. He kind of hit a wall. And he went to his leadership team and he said, you have to help me. My life, this is out of control. I can't possibly do all this work. And they showed a little bit of tough love, to be honest. They said, look, you're the CEO. You're the only one that sees all of those 6 spinning plates. If you can't tell us what the priorities are that you need to spend time on, we can't help you with that. Now, if you can articulate where you think it's most important, we can help you manage to it. And so the invitation for any leader is to say, given your role and what you can see, what is the work that only you can do? Which is different than, I'm going to be helpful and do every little bits and pieces that are possible, which is, in some ways a servant mindset, a nice mindset. You're going to drown as a CEO if you do that. What is the work that if no one else does it, it won't happen? Or sorry, if you don't do it, no one else can, and it won't happen. And what does that look like? It might be a really hard people decision on your team. It might be that the whole team has been swirling on resource allocation, even the CFO is in on it, and they just need someone to come in and make a call. It might be that, I think about Marilyn Houston at Lockheed Martin, a lot of her clients were world leaders around the world, right, in aerospace and defense. There were certain meetings that they expected the CEO to show up. You don't send an underling 4 levels down to go to fly to wherever it is and meet with the world leader. But it should be quite a short list, and you should be quite thoughtful about, is this something that truly only the CEO can do, and everything else, either delegate it, maybe it doesn't need to get done, or find another way.
There is a endless list of requests upon most CEOs, and as you said earlier, only a certain number of hours in a day they can fulfill. What are the things CEOs should stop doing? What do you advise most CEOs to stop doing in order to make space for the things that only they could do?
That's a great question. I think part of it is being really thoughtful in advance as much as you can about what are the 4 or 5 priorities this month or this quarter that you personally are going to make a meaningful difference on. And then being ruthless with your calendar, with your EA or your chief of staff to guard towards those. And some of those priorities are the invisible work of a CEO, because you spend a lot of time helping other people with their jobs, but there's work, Once the organization's running well, you're the one looking ahead. What's coming next? What are the next trends? What do we have to get ahead of? How am I learning? Satya Nadella spends one whole day a month just for him to learn. I mean, that seems indulgent, but he realizes that if he's not on top of the trends, what's happening outside, he can't be a good leader. And he dedicates that time. Brad Smith, when he was the CEO of Intuit, was very thoughtful about having thinking time for himself. It's funny, during the early days of the pandemic, it's one of the things a lot of CEOs missed was their flight time, because those airplane times had been a time for them to think, and suddenly it was gone. And now, even with airplanes, you can do calls and emails and all these other things. And so treating those thinking time as important as any other meeting and not letting it get eroded away is really important. So it's just as much what you're saying yes to spending your time on as what you're saying no to.
When you started into the research that led to writing CEO Excellence, is there anything that you really anticipated would matter that ended up not mattering?
Interesting. I think one thing that was a surprise was I actually expected, and my authors and I have talked about this, we expected the CEOs as they got further into their tenure to maybe even be more confident, more overconfident, more directive, especially when you're on year 5, 6, 15, 20. You know, you've done a great job, you're doing well. I think we thought those folks would be a little bit more top down. It turns out the further they get into their tenure and the more successful they are, or maybe it's why they're successful, they were actually much more open to learning, much more open to listening, much more willing to admit that they didn't necessarily know what they were doing. You know, there was an amazing investor we talked to who said when they first started investing, they were always 90% sure about the deal. Now, 25 years in, they're only 10% sure of each deal. But because of that, they ask good questions. They get really smart. They dig in for the details. I think that was something that really surprised us, was that quality became more and more apparent as they went on.
I love that. It's a great reminder for intellectual humility. The more we know, the more we realize, the less we know. So that's wonderful. So you now, after publishing CEO Excellence a few years ago, you now are publishing your second follow-up book. Congratulations. It's coming out today, October 7th, called CEO for All Seasons. So evidently, there was something in CEO Excellence that you didn't cover that sparked the decision to write the second book. So maybe talk about that transition from writing CEO Excellence to CEO for All Seasons. What motivated you to write this second book?
A CEO for All Seasons is very much a companion piece to CEO Excellence. In CEO Excellence, we were answering two questions. What is the role anyway? And what are the mindsets of those who do it well? I think what energized us a lot over the last few years was how many people came to us with their dog-eared copies with notes in the margin, and you know, they were really using it as a workbook, to be honest, which made you realize that there was a felt need for that. People wanted something very practical, very in the moment. And you couple that with the fact that a third of CEOs don't make it past the first 3 years. Right, and up to $1 trillion in value is destroyed on the S&P by bungled CEO transitions that don't go well. And we were struck by this idea that understanding each stage of the CEO journey, each season of that journey, what are the expectations, what are the demands, and what does it take to do it well, was not only important for those individual leaders to be successful, but for organizations to go through those cycles in a way that adds value and avoids a lot of the disruption that we see.
Can you walk through for our listeners what those 4 seasons are? This is not a replacement for reading the book. Everybody should still go out and buy it on Amazon or your local bookstore, but maybe give them a little taste of what those 4 seasons are.
For sure. I mean, the 4 seasons essentially start in the spring when you are just, a little baby bud thinking about maybe being a CEO one day. It's not the book only for, hey, it's the night before my interview, how do I do it well? This is the 2 or 3 years before you aspire to a next big job. It can be a CEO role. Frankly, it could be another big leadership role as well. What are the things you do to get ready? Turns out 68% of the high-performing CEOs said in hindsight, they weren't prepared. It wasn't the job they necessarily thought it was. So what can you do in those 2 or 3 years leading up to the role to get really prepared? Not just to be given the job, but do well once you're in it. And how do you think about your own motivation? How do you think about your own skills and development to get ready? Season 2 then is summer. You're in the role. You're a brand new CEO. You're flourishing. How do you hit the ground running and go through your first year or two with tremendous success, set the tone for your tenure, make sure you're not one of those folks that don't make it past year 3, you're off to the races. Season 3 then is your middle years, and those can be short, they can be long. Some of the CEOs we've interviewed have been in the role for 20 plus years. In those middle years, it's all about not being complacent, right? How do you keep it fresh? How do you keep the cycles going? And then you get to the 4th season, which is about finishing strong. And we purposely refer to it as a cycle because as sort of winter's there, it's also planting the seeds and the things for the spring. Because as you're finishing in your tenure and preparing to hand over the reins, you're also preparing the ground for the new person to come in and be wildly successful. So it's purposely a cycle for you and for the organization.
When I was kind of reviewing these 4 seasons ahead of time, there was one season that I anticipated being in there that wasn't, which is dealing with the hard storms of winter. Before I joined FranklinCovey, I was the CEO of a startup. The hardest, most memorable experiences were the moments where we felt a failure at our door and we didn't feel like our customers loved our product and whatnot. So maybe talk me through why the path that you've outlined is very much the happy path of the CEO experience. Where does overcoming difficulty, tumult, turbulence fit into the CEO for all seasons?
I think there can be challenge and turbulence in every season, right? Some new CEOs come into a huge turnaround and they're digging out of a hole from day one. I think a lot of it sits in that season 3, which I guess for us was fall. So think hurricanes and thunderstorms, right? There's still tricky weather even in the fall. And I think it's in those middle years especially where CEOs can get caught off guard by some of the really difficult times. If it's been going well, the risk is complacency, right? The risk is you assume what you've been doing will carry you forward until there's a shock to the system and you find out the hard way that it's not. And if it's been challenging, and already the organization is fatigued, right? The challenges are more around how do we keep going? I think in either situation, that those middle years, it's important to take and continue an outsider view. Right? At that point, you've been in the role for long enough. Sometimes you're a little blinded or blinkered to what's really happening. I love 2 stories. So Michael Dell, who's been a CEO since he was 19, by the way, so you can imagine how many decades that's been at Dell. And he, of course, has had to really jolt the organization several times to keep it fresh. He talks about a story where he walked into his leadership team and he said, I want you all to imagine it's 3 or 5 years from now. And a new attacker has come into the computer space. They know our customers, they're better than us, the customer experience is better, the tech is better, and they're clocking us, they're eating our lunch. Imagine that situation. Now ask ourselves, what would it take for us to be that attacker? Right? If we were that new entrant that was disrupting our model, what would that look like? And it prompted a whole host of really important discussions on his leadership team, taking that external view of what are we not seeing? What are we not acknowledging? What are we not challenging ourselves? And what would that look like? That kind of fresh thinking is so important. Reed Hastings at Netflix is another classic, right? Where he was disrupting his own business. I don't think any of us, a lot of us don't even remember the mail order by CD-ROM business. I tried to explain it to my kids. You put the movie in the envelope, you sent it off, they sent you a new one back. He never started Netflix thinking that that would be their business forever, right? His goal was to transform entertainment. And because he had that view, that longer view, they were willing to disrupt themselves, right? And go into streaming and all. Now, it was bumpy. They had some lessons learned as they did that, but they had the courage to ask the hard questions and to disrupt their own business model. And it's that kind of outside thinking that really makes the difference in those harder middle years.
It's interesting that you bring up those 2 examples, Michael Dell and Reed Hastings. I mean, Michael Dell, as you said, started CEO at 19. His name is the company name. He is the archetypal founder CEO in that way. There are many different types of CEOs. You have the founder CEO, you have the family firm CEO that inherits the business, you have the executive hire that's brought in, you have somebody who's grown up inside of the business and then gets promoted from their excellence into the top leadership position. How does it differ? How do these 4 seasons differ based on the type of CEO that you are and kind of how you've come into that position?
I think the basics of the role and the basics of the phases are largely the same across contexts, but they all obviously do change. Private equity portfolio company CEO is different than public, different industries, different countries. There's nuance in the culture. I would say if I were the two trickiest when we think about transition, family owned is quite tricky, right? I work with a number of family owned businesses. They can be incredible in their flexibility, their long-term view, their ability to invest. Some of the transition of leadership can be quite delicate, right? When is the one generation going to pass on to the next? What do they have to prove? All of those sorts of things. And also from founder to first-time professional CEO is also another transition that is quite delicate, right? Sitting here in Silicon Valley, there's a number of founders where they found it really hard to have a professional CEO take over. What does that look like? I think in any of those moments, though, the key is to have real clarity around different people's roles and what it needs to do. Even in a public company context, 17% of retiring CEOs now are becoming executive chair. They're staying in the business day to day. Sometimes that can be helpful. Sometimes that can be terrible governance, especially if it's for an undisclosed amount of time and their role is unclear. One of my clients, the retiring CEO, literally wouldn't move out of his office. He kept coming in every day to the same office. So the new person in the leadership team just moved. Yeah, they moved the executive team to a new floor and just left him there by himself, which maybe is also slightly passive aggressive. But you kind of see these transitions and how hard they are. And I think that's part of why we really wanted to think through each of the stages and give guidance on how to do it well.
In the last decade or so, there's been a decent amount of controversy around CEO pay. How much do CEOs matter? Your research, I think McKinsey found that 50% of firm performance is defined by the industry tailwinds, and that only 1 out of 12 firms actually jump from average to top quintile. So maybe talking about your research about the impact of CEOs. This is a role that we lionize, but are they incredibly important for the long-term success of companies?
I think they're incredibly important for a couple of different reasons. One, as you said, a huge part of your value creation is based on the industry you're in and where you're positioned. So that's true. But beyond that, what's the difference between outperforming and not within it? The research we did of the top 200 CEOs who've been highest performing, turns out they created an incremental $5 trillion of value versus the average CEOs in their peer set, in their industries. That's equivalent almost to the GDP of Germany. So you think about the incremental value of having someone who's excellent in their role for all of the stakeholders, right? The employee opportunities that creates, the investor opportunities, the communities, the customers, all of those things. So being excellent truly does matter. I think that's different than just saying all CEOs in general add that. They don't, but that's why our focus has been on what does it take to be exceptional? Because when you're exceptional, it really, really matters.
So in the last 40 years, CEO pay is up 10x. The average CEO now makes 300 times the median employee. There was a 2010 paper that found that firms with higher paid CEOs subsequently underperform in both stock price and accounting metrics. So two-part question. One is, does your research back this up, that CEO pay is actually counterproductive or the CEOs who are highly paid actually underperform? And second, do you think CEOs today are overpaid?
Important questions. I haven't dug into the research on pay specifically and the correlations. Our focus is very much on what is the incremental value that the CEOs add, and then how do we do that? So much more a playbook of how do you make sure you're someone who earns their keep? Right? I'm not a pay expert, but I do think there's a huge difference between CEOs who do very, very well and the average. And I think that's so important to focus on.
Got it. That makes sense. So to close, I want to move towards what's next, both for CEOs and for your research. There has been a lot written about effectively implementing AI throughout an organization. And I'm sure many of the CEOs you talk to are grappling with AI implementation. What are the best CEOs doing to drive effective AI adoption and implementation?
This is such an important topic right now. I think everyone is learning as they go. I think the best CEOs are doing a couple of things. One, they are absolutely recognizing the pace of change, and they're not putting their heads in the sand in terms of this is real, it's happening, and we need to be thinking about it. I think tactically, they're learning and practicing themselves. Right? They're spending time on evenings and weekends actually learning, playing with it, seeing what's possible. What does that look like? And I think the CEOs who are really being thoughtful with their teams about AI are thinking expansively around what's possible. There's a lot of near-term focus right now on productivity and efficiency, and I do think that's a benefit of AI. I suspect the bigger game is going to go well beyond that. Right now that we have this capability, what will that look like? What could that unleash for us? But it has real implications for your organization. Right? What does it look like in terms of the talent? Is the AI a tool? Is it a replacement? Is it something we're going to work alongside? I was with the CEO of a tech company yesterday who's very much thinking about agents, AI-based agents, almost as employees. What would that do if you thought differently that way? So I think it's a real moment of learning, rapid cycles of testing and experimenting, and all kind of moving on this journey together.
So we talk about what's next for leaders, but what's next for you? I feel bad asking this question on the day that your book is coming out because you just have accomplished something so impressive, but what's next for you in your research and your work at McKinsey?
I mean, to me, these books and the publication really are just the beginning of a lot of great conversations that I think are where the power and the impact really comes from. So I'm excited that this book can be the start of a conversation with different leaders on what does it take to do the job well? What kind of bold ambitions do they have for their companies? How do they want to lead? Increasingly, as we look at leadership around the world, I think we're looking more and more towards company leaders to be a bit of a guiding light in terms of where is their opportunity? How will we shape the world? Even questions like AI. Yes, the technologists created it. It's up to our leaders to help us shape how we'll use it and how we will shape it in a way that's great for everyone. And so I'm excited to dive in and to start working with leaders to think about what it is they want to achieve on behalf of all of their constituents.
I love that. So we're going to close by moving to a lightning round of a few quick questions for you. So first is you wrote a book about mindsets. FranklinCovey, we're obsessed about mindsets as well. But we also think about how do you move from mindsets to behaviors. And so what is the CEO daily habit that you think every CEO in America should adopt?
There was a great mindset related to how you show up as a CEO, which was your to-be list. And it was Michael from Cincinnati Children's Hospital who showed us this one. So just like you have your to-do list every day, he goes and looks next to each meeting he has, and he writes, how do I need to be as a leader in each of those moments? This isn't about being inauthentic or disingenuous. It's recognizing that how he shows up in a meeting has a disproportionate impact on everyone in that room. So do I need to be decisive because the team's been swirling and they just need an answer? I'm then going into a town hall where my role is to be inspiring. That's what the organization needs of its leader in that moment. And so that question I think any of us can ask, which is, what does my team, my organization need of me as a leader in this moment? And how do I live into that? It's incredibly powerful.
A big part of the role of CEO is board management, which we haven't discussed extensively today. But what is a board management mindset or best practice that CEOs should adopt?
This is the one that had probably the biggest difference between high performers and the average CEOs. Because let's be honest, the prevailing wisdom is a little bit, the board is something I have to tolerate, get through the board meeting, go back to running my business. These high performing CEOs thought quite differently. They said, how do I need to be so that the directors can be really helpful to me in my business? How would I show up differently to enable them to be amazing resources? I would make sure I was honest with them. They had the real context of what was going on. I understood each of their skill sets and I could tap into it. And I had a trust-based relationship with them so that they knew I wasn't hiding things. And that takes real courage because sometimes I have to admit things aren't going well. Those were the high-performing CEOs. How do I help the board help me?
Let's imagine that you got access to a billboard that every CEO in America drove by. What would you put on that billboard? And it can't be buy CEO for all seasons. Maybe that's like a little sub message. Or what's the main non-commercial message you would put on the billboard for every CEO to read?
I think the CEO role comes with a huge responsibility and invitation. So it's how can I do my best work to leave this place better than I found it? Sounds like a trope, but these are unbelievably important roles, and it's not actually about you. Maybe that would be the phrase. It's not about you. It's about everyone you're working in service of.
I love that. So closing question, FranklinCovey is a leadership company. And so we always ask this question to all of our guests to end. Who is a leader that you have worked with closely in your career who has had a profound impact on you, and what lessons can we all learn from them?
I was reflecting on this one over the summer, so I'm going to use it. At the risk of it being cheesy, I'm actually going to talk about my dad. My dad was an amazing leader, and I think what he really instilled in me from early days was that every single person you interact with is a human of equal value. And so he was always very mindful of being just as friendly and helpful to the security guy or the receptionist as another CEO. And people feel that. And I think it ripples down through an organization. It also gives me the courage to walk in and interview all these legendary CEOs and not be too freaked out, because they're also just humans who are in these really hard jobs. And I think if we all just interacted with each other as well-intentioned, good humans trying to do the right thing wherever we are, it benefits everyone.
Wonderful. Well, that's a great one to close on. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. Congratulations on the book. For all of you listening, CEO for All Seasons is out and available today. And the previous book, CEO Excellence, is excellent as well. So I encourage everybody listening to go grab those too. Carolyn, thank you so much for joining FranklinCovey on Leadership today. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Fantastic to be here. Thanks so much, Will.
Absolutely. And to everybody listening, thank you for spending the time with us. We hope you join us next week for another episode of FranklinCovey on Leadership.